Creation, Book of Portals, Chapter 4. The light was no longer blinding. It was softer this time, tinted. She looked around, but it took a while for her eyes to adjust to her new environment. She felt as if she were looking through a thin, almost clear film. She briefly wondered how long she had been asleep. She blinked, trying to clear her eyes, and when that didn't help, she brought her hands up to rub them. While doing so, she noticed her arms felt tight, squeezed almost. For the first time since opening her eyes, she looked at her body. Her experiences from what seemed like moments before flashed through her mind. She was just floating in space, or rather, watching her body as it floated through space. She grabbed her arms, her legs. She was definitely there, in her body again. She examined herself. She was no longer wearing her spacesuit, or even the external cooling garment she would wear underneath the suit. Instead, she was wearing a very thin, smooth, flesh-like covering that blended in with her skin so well, it made her look almost nude. She felt along the surface of the covering, searching for an edge and couldn't find one. The extra skin wrapped around every toe, every finger, even her fingernails were encased in this thin, smooth covering. Then, she looked closer. The coloring on her fingernails were off. Instead of their usual pale, pinkish color, they were tinted brown, like her skin. With a sudden realization, she started to search her body further, this time up her torso, her neck, her head. She found even her hair was encased, her nose, her mouth, her tongue, all wrapped in this fleshy covering. Then, slowly she moved her hands toward her eyes. She waved her fingers in front of her face and realized even the palms of her hands looked brown. She brought her fingers to her eyes. She touched the surface of her eyeball and didn't wince. She gasped in horror. The flesh-like material even covered her eyes. She started clawing at her body, attempting to rip the flesh-like suit from her skin. At first it didn't work. Her skin-encased nails weren't sharp enough against the covering. But then, she used her teeth, dragging the edges of her canines along her arms repeatedly, until finally, the suit began to tear. With the first split at her wrist, she hooked her fingers underneath the tear, ripping the artificial skin from her own. As she tore at the covering and peeled it back, she felt a deep, burning sensation. She grimaced as each flesh-like layer torn from her skin started to smoke as it fell from her. Though it pained her, she continued to rip and tear at the flesh. Finally, she reached her face. She let out a scream as she ripped at the false skin. Pulling at it extended her own skin further than she thought possible. She hooked her fingers under a piece of flesh that covered her mouth and eyes. She readied herself to rip it off in one go. She mustered all her strength and tore it away. Her scream was not human. The pain pierced deep into her bones. With the fleshy covering off of her, she felt a brief second of relief before she realized she couldn't breathe. And her eyes were once again blinded by the impossibly bright lights. She clenched them shut, but the pain from ripping off the flesh intensified. She choked on the non-existent air. The room she was in was white, too white. She couldn't see the door. She tumbled off the small bed she was lying on and onto the floor. Her astronaut training allowed her about 7 minutes of consciousness before passing out from lack of oxygen. She couldn't tell how long it had been. She had to get help. She crawled on the ground, eyes barely open, toward a wall. She felt along the wall for a switch, a button, a speaker. Nothing. The walls were smooth. The burning continued. Behind her there was movement. She turned around to see, through her tightly squinted eyes, a figure, an impossibly tall figure looming above her. She couldn't see it clearly, her eyes bloodshot red, feeling as if knives were piercing them. She reached out to the figure for help. It touched the skin of her hand and she felt sudden relief. Her limbs went numb. She collapsed to the floor, suddenly paralyzed again. She didn't know how much time she had been holding her breath, but soon she found her vision growing dark again. Her body fully settled into the floor as the figure loomed over her. This time, she kept her eyes closed as the weight of her back pressed into the hard bed beneath her. The idea of flesh coating her eyeballs was not something she was prepared for, even less the pain of attempting to remove it. She instead focused on her body. She felt warm. She briefly wondered if she was still in space, because the only thing she was sure of was that she was no longer on the International Space Station. The station. The memory of being thrust into space by the Canadian flashed through her mind. Anger rose in her throat. Her hands tightened into fists beside her. Why did they do it? She had to make sure to get back so she could report.
It is safe to open your eyes now.
The voice. It was the first one she heard in what felt like weeks. She thought she heard it, at least. It sounded thin, almost metallic, as if gears were being grated together to form words. She opened her eyes. She was in the same room as before, white, but with a dulled, brown-tinted hue to it. She sat up, searching for where the sound came from. No one was in the room with her. She felt her body tense ever so slightly with the realization.
Right.
She heard the voice again. As if a switch were flipped, she could suddenly see her surroundings clearly. She blinked a few times. The room was brighter than just a few seconds ago, but not as blindingly bright as before. The brown tint was mostly gone now. She looked around and the source of the voice was suddenly in the room. She recoiled at the sight before her. Standing in the room was a tall creature twice her size. It stood at least 10 feet tall. It was thin, yet its muscles were clearly defined. Its head was rounded, almost a perfect circle. Its mouth had very thin lips. It had 4 eyes, 2 large eyes in the middle, and 1 smaller eye on either side. The larger eyes were at least 8 times the size of a human's, but they were completely black. Its skin was a silvery blue. Her uncle had told her about aliens before, but never in a million years would she have ever entertained the idea that they were real.
Too scary.
The voice was heard again. It was less metallic. It was now smooth, hypnotic. She realized the voice wasn't coming from the creature in front of her. It was in her mind. She sat up in her bed suddenly.
Sorry. Let me try again.
This time, the alien creature moved its mouth in the shape of the words. She could tell the sound was still coming from her head, as the mouth was a little out of sync.
Is this the right body shape?
The alien gestured at itself. She gazed at its form. Images flashed through her mind of the dozens of movie depictions of aliens she'd seen throughout her life. This one that stood before her looked closest to E.T., except smooth, less friendly, and with a rounded head.
Really? That? Okay.
The alien twisted its wrist, and suddenly it turned from a lanky, looming figure to a 3-foot tall replica of E.T.
Better?
She still couldn't find the words to say. She just stared at the now short and wrinkled creature in front of her. She thought back to her training, the years of schooling she went through just to step foot onto a space shuttle. Nothing had ever prepared her for this. The creature was now staring up at her, expectantly. She figured she should say something, but found that she couldn't. There was no air to breathe, so she couldn't speak. But if she couldn't breathe, how was she alive? She started pulling at the flesh covering around her mouth.
Don't. It supplies oxygen straight into your bloodstream through your skin. Remember how much it hurt when you tried to remove it? There are tiny needles consistently injecting oxygen into you. It lives off the carbon dioxide you excrete in your blood. Symbiotic relationship.
She opened her mouth again to respond. Nothing came out. The creature flicked its shriveled hand toward her.
Try now.
It's alive? Her voice was just in her mind, even though her lips formed the words. Still, the creature responded.
Yes, it is called an. It is a plant derived from photonic organisms grown in the catantropal region of our planet. It lives as long as it is connected to a carbon-based source. It releases a thick vapor into the air when it is endangered. You killed one earlier by ripping it off you. It is to be expected, though. You are human.
I'm sorry.
Do not be. We properly laid it to rest.
She looked around, wanting to change the subject. She noticed the lights around her. They didn't seem to be plugged into any source. They were just orbs floating in place. Gazing at them made her chest feel empty. Then she remembered. Her hands moved to her eyes. How am I able to see clearly now?
We communicate with the Amira using a high-pitched frequency. I simply asked it to thin itself around your eyes. In addition to providing your bloodstream with oxygen, it is connected directly to your brainstem, allowing effortless communication between us, since you use air and we use frequency.
She tilted her head and focused her ears. She didn't hear anything at all. Even the movement of her body against the bed was silent. The creature smiled. It wasn't comforting.
You do not need to know everything.
It answered plainly. She brought her hands up to feel around her head. There was a small dent at the back of her neck, right beneath her skull. She inquired further. So, if this Anura thing is connected to my brainstem... The creature finished her thought.
If you would have continued ripping the organism from your head, you would be dead. I intervened once necessary.
She fell silent, pulling her hand away from the area. She had been so close to killing herself. The creature examined its own body.
Curious, what do you think of this new form? I am in charge of breeding new humans, and there seems to be an attachment to this particular extraterrestrial creature.
For the first time in what felt like centuries, she found herself amused. I think I'd rather you morph back into your original form. This one's a bit freaky. I'd like to keep my childhood memories intact. The creature nodded.
Very well.
The creature stuck its wrist out again and twisted it in the air. Within a blink, the creature morphed from the 3-foot ET figure to a 7-foot tall lizard creature. It had thick, shiny scales that gleamed iridescent in the lights. Its eyes were small, a pale blue. Its teeth were thin, long, and sharp. Its arms stretched with claws that ejected from the ends of its wrists. Her eyes grew wide as she saw the new creature in front of her. She was speechless.
This is our normal form.
She recoiled from the creature. I'm sorry. I meant the first one I saw. The creature flicked its wrist again, transforming into the 10-foot tall, silvery blue creature from before. Her voice was small. Maybe a bit shorter? The creature flicked its wrist again, shrinking to a 6-foot tall version of itself. She relaxed a bit. Then, with the scales, those were cool. Flicking its wrist, the creature grew the shiny, iridescent scales across its blue form. The scales reflected in the light, making it look almost pretty. She released the tension from her body, nodding in approval.
I am so pleased you approve,
the creature said dryly. She held her hands up. Listen, I've been around humans all my life. Cut me a little slack. From my perspective, this is a lot to get used to.
Understandable.
She gestured around the room. So, where am I, anyway?
That is usually the first thing humans ask.
I'd like to think I'm not most humans. The creature tilted its head.
You killed the very thing keeping you alive, so I will reserve judgment for a later time.
She laughed, a forgotten feeling.
We are Narlips, from the planet Naleo. This is our ship, and you are currently located in the medical ward. When we found you, you were dehydrated and suffering from extreme signs of stress. You were in the early stages of a heart attack when we stumbled upon your spacesuit in the Great Expanse. The humans we encounter are usually not in that bad of shape.
The Great Expanse?
Space.
Oh. And my suit? Where is it? The creature responded shortly.
Safe.
She tilted her head. She noticed the creature was still mouthing the words it was speaking, even though no sound was coming out. You said you encounter other humans. How often?
Every human decade, give or take.
She shifted her position in bed, suddenly uncomfortable. What do you do with them? The Narlip creature didn't answer this. She pressed further. Will I be able to return home? The Narlip studied her. She felt exposed. The hairs on her skin stood up, even beneath the Anura. She felt like she was being searched. As the Narlip opened its mouth to speak, a door appeared in the wall of the room. She was startled. Another Narlip, looking identical to the one currently in the room, entered. She looked at this new Narlip, perplexed. The new Narlip spoke.
K1, you are dismissed. I'll take it from here.
K1 nodded at this new Narlip, and then her, before swiftly exiting the room. The door disappeared. The new Narlip gestured at itself.
We were told you like this form better.
This Narlip didn't bother mouthing the words as it spoke. Its voice carried a forced, friendly tone. She decided she preferred the smooth, monotone voice of K1. It seemed a bit more genuine.
Humans usually prefer E.T.
She answered back with the same amount of forced friendliness. I think I'd prefer for you to be in your regular form. There was a brief silence between them before the Narlip answered politely.
Very well.
The creature flicked its wrists in the same way K1 did. It formed into its lizard-like form. Choking back the fear that rose when it revealed itself, she focused on steadying her heart. She had to allow herself to get used to this. She had already noticed that there was a chance she would never make it back home. She decided to ask a question. What do you want with me? Without skipping a beat, the Narlip answered.
Finally, a question that matters.
Hello again, this is Michaela Simone Mack. I am the author and narrator of Creation, Book of Portals. Thank you so much for listening thus far. We are almost halfway through. I'm so excited to be sharing this story with you, the entirety of this series. I appreciate every listen, every like, and every comment that you have been giving me thus far. And I would appreciate even more feedback. And if you would like, share it with your friends, share it on other platforms to help me to grow this podcast into something even bigger. In any case, I have huge plans for this podcast and for the story moving forward, and I am excited to see your reactions to the future of this journey in Book of Portals and then the other seasons as well. In any case, thank you again for listening. I greatly appreciate your support. Thank you so much. Have a great day. See you next Friday.